Now we're going to talk about how to write a body paragraph for your language analysis. So this is from the same document that we've worked on from introduction. And for a body paragraph, a couple of things to take note. Each body paragraph explores one argument by the author. Remember that each of these arguments should support the main contention, okay? And for your language response, we will be looking for 3 body paragraphs, so that will be 3 supporting arguments of the main contention. In your body paragraph, we refer to the author by their last name. So, for example, Matthias. And you know this very well, but year 10, in the body paragraph, we follow the structure of a deep. Okay, so we're going to break down a deep for you, and then we're going to actually show an example of a paragraph. A, argument and tone. So what we want in the very first paragraph, the very first body paragraph, is the initial tone and the initial argument, or the idea the author uses to support the contention. Now, in the second and third body paragraphs, we'll be talking about the shifting tone, okay? Because that will be, does the tone change? If the tone doesn't change, you don't really need to mention that. You can talk about maintaining that tone. But just wanted to differentiate the difference between initial and shifting was for the first body paragraph, and then for subsequent, the second and third. So as I've mentioned, you will be required to write 3 body paragraphs. We need to identify 3 arguments from the text that we are analysing, and we're going to look at that in a moment. We then need to look at the device. Now, the device is what the author uses to help convince the audience of their argument. Here are some ideas of what devices might be used: emotive language, varied sentence structure. So you might see like a short and sharp, punchy sentence. That could be sort of a device used to get your attention. The use of a statistic, okay? Data, personal testimony, so a personal story, expert opinion, and an anecdote. So it could be sort of like an allegory or an anecdote that someone can relate to of another kind of story. So what you will need to do is identify which one has the most influence on that particular argument. There may be quite a few being used. So try to, you can feel free to mention them all, the ones that are being used, but then try to narrow it down to the one and how is that being used. What we're then going to ask is for example and evidence from the text. Excuse me. So the example, it shouldn't have to be copied rote, okay? You don't need to like get a whole section and just cut and paste and copy it again. Just find the direct example of that device. So it might just be one word or a couple of words, just so we're aware that you can actually find that and identify where it's being used. Now, making a mention here that these first 3 sections really should be covered in no more than 2 to 3 sentences. So when you talk about the example, you're not actually saying if it's effective, okay? It's more just like saying, here it is, okay? So you're just kind of giving us that information. So because you're going to be saying that in 2 to 3 sentences, write succinctly as you identify the argument, device, and how it is used, okay? Where it is being used. Now, sorry, I shouldn't say how, where, okay, which is the example. Now, the next 2 parts is what's most important for you actually analysing, and this is where you show the effect, okay? What is the effect on the audience? How is it shaping the audience's thoughts or feelings? So this is the effect of the device. So if the author used emotive language, what effect is that having? How does that make the audience think? If they're using statistics, how might that affect the audience? Does it give them more credibility as the writer? Does it make the audience feel that they can trust the writer because they've done research, etc.? If it's a personal story, again, how would that affect the audience? Again, you're analysing its effect. So talking about perhaps the emotive or sort of cognitive engagement that the audience is having with the writer because of this device, okay? we see an example of personal story being used in the article of the R word, and that has the effect of empathy from the audience and a sense of they respect this because it's someone's real story. You can't argue with that. And finally, P, the purpose. Why has the author tried to make the reader think or feel this way? Okay, this is when you actually then bring it back to connecting the argument with the contention. So they're not just doing it for the sake of, okay, I want you to believe my argument. Really, what they're trying to do is point you back to the main contention, okay? And we know that in the R word article, what we agreed upon is that the main contention is that the R word should not be used as an insult. So how does argument point you back to that contention? All right, now we're going to discuss what that looks like in the R word article. Okay, before we write our body paragraphs, we actually need to identify what are the arguments that we are going to discuss in this language analysis essay. So, as you will remember, we have just annotated this text and we've identified devices, we've identified sort of effects, okay, what he's saying and how it has an effect. And this is something we will refer back to in our body paragraph. This is evidence. But what I haven't yet done with you is broken down 3 arguments. So I think it was pretty clear that from the introduction, when we wrote that together, we actually identified that the contention is that the R word is not to be used to insult a person. Okay, I think that was a pretty clear contention, but we haven't yet broken it down into arguments. So for time's sake, I've actually already considered these arguments, which I'd like to propose to you students. You can choose to use the arguments I've come up with, or you might find different arguments that I hadn't thought of. Now, admittedly, this text, it was a little difficult to find distinct arguments because it's not sort of structured in very clear block paragraphs, okay? There's a lot of ideas that run between different paragraphs. For example, here, when he talks about, the idea of what people have about people with a disability, and he kind of continues these different personal anecdotes over a few different lines. So I took a moment, it took me about 10 minutes or so to try to consider what are some distinct arguments, and I've come up with 4 of them. So the 4 arguments that I thought of, and again, you might think of a different one, these are the ones. So the first argument is, and again, it all comes back to the contention, guys. So remember, this is the main contention. These arguments support the contention. The first argument I found is that retard, okay, the R word is not an insult. This term refers to holding back in terms of progress. It is associated with people with an intellectual disability who are not dumb. Now, I got that main argument from his opening, okay? That was my own words, but when he's talking about the fact that actually it doesn't mean you're dumb and shallow, okay, I do process information more slowly, and if you do look up the dictionary definition of retard, that's actually what it means, to process slower, okay? So that would be the first argument. The second argument I would suggest would be that living with an intellectual disability, actually, these people have conquered incredible feats, okay? They've actually conquered incredible challenges and struggles in their life, and they should be considered with honor, not disdain. And we see that evidenced in quite a few lines when he talks about people who have had to overcome, being bullied and bad healthcare, etc. And so that would be, I would say, a really strong argument that I would definitely mention. The third argument I thought of was this one. The society widely accepts the use of the term to be used in a derogative manner. There needs to be a learning. So what he's saying is this. I would suggest his argument is not just to Coulter. It's not just to Anne to say, hey, Anne, that was ridiculous. How did you think you'd get away with that? What he's actually saying is society generally needs to learn this lesson as well. And why did I think that? Well, he says that a little bit earlier on. Oh, losing battery. He says that a bit earlier on. He actually talks about the fact public's perception, okay, the rest of you. But then actually later on here, actually he says this. After I saw your tweet, I realized that you assumed that people would understand and accept that being linked to someone like me is an insult, and you assumed you could get away with it and still appear on TV. So basically, what he's actually arguing here is that we have an issue. It's like we wouldn't use the term, and I said it before in the annotations, we wouldn't use like a really horrible racist term or maybe a homophobic term and not feel like we can get away with it because people would be like, hey, that's just not okay. But what he's saying is that when we're talking about intellectual disability and some of the terms we might use, actually, we've got a way to go. As a society, we still use terms about intellectual disability in a really insulting way when we're not talking about a person with disability. I hope that makes sense. So that would be my other argument. And the fourth argument I've come up with is, and I thought this was also a really strong one, and this was seen in his tone, okay? I felt that his tone was direct, but it was also friendly. Like I mentioned, he ends up by saying, come to the Olympics. He concludes by saying, you know, the friend you haven't met yet. So I would suggest one of his arguments is this: if you interact with a person with a disability, it will shift your perspective. It is possible to broaden your understanding through building relationship with someone. So perhaps this argument would then help you not use the R word in an insulting way because you've built relationship with people with intellectual disabilities. So Tens, I've given you 4 different argument suggestions. And so I'm going to allow you to choose 2 of them. Now, the reason I say 2 is because I've already done one for you. I've actually done the first one, okay? So I'm going to show you now an example of writing a paragraph based on the first argument, and then you're going to choose 2 of these 3, so just 2 of the 3, or think of your own, okay? You can choose your own, where you're going to actually write the body paragraph, okay?